Okay, Brent Swallow here, back with mini lecture 5 of 6 in this section on, or the module on technology choices in food and agriculture. So far, I brought you up to kind of reviewing the technical basis about insecticides, herbicides, plant breeding, thinking about these development of these two transgenic crops that are resistant to insects and resistant to glyphosate. Telling the story, walking through the sort of the story about glyphosate, and that's all primarily in a developed country context, a place where companies like Monsanto could develop these technologies like transgenics and get them released. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now, is sort of that policy context. So the policy context and the principles underlying that policy context, focusing primarily on biotechnology, so the genetic resource development, and thinking about contrasts between places like the United States and many developing countries. So there's a few key concepts. One of them here is burden of proof. So we're gonna hopefully that'll become clear fairly soon, is why we're going to talk about burden of proof. But think about that story about the health effects of glyphosate and the $289 million settlement made for one particular case of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma associated with glyphosate use, and the $10 billion set aside for that settlement. So there's a story about what's the evidence. So how do companies get the right to release their products, and what holds them accountable? So this is burden of proof is kind of a key issue. If we think about burden of proof as a sort of a general definition, is a rule of evidence. So evidence about, kind of knowledge or fact that makes a person prove a certain thing, or the contrary will be assumed by the court. So you have to, are you going to prove, the burden of proof is such a thing holds, like there's a health effect or there's environmental effect of glyphosate. How will that statement be validated as sort of true, right? So burden of proof is what's the proof, the level of proof which it takes for something to be kind of upheld as, yeah, that's the thing, right? That's the thing, and we need to take kind of remedial action as a result of that. So what's that level of proof? What's that burden? The first thing is, what's the default? There's these three components here. What's the default assumption? So do we assume that new technology has no effect on the environment? Do we assume that new technology has lots of effect on the environment? So that's the default, right? So what do we start with? Second is, depending on what we think of as the default, that tells us who would bear the cost of disproving the default. So we say the default is glyphosate has no environmental effect. Then we must prove that glyphosate has an environmental effect to overcome that default, right? Versus if we assumed the glyphosate has effects, then you'd have to do a lot of research to show it doesn't have effect to offset that default assumption. And that would tell you who would be bearing that cost. And the last part of this burden of proof is kind of what standard of truth is required for the default assumption to be disproved. And we think about this in the legal matter, sort of the legal analogy in Canada, but you can also have criminal cases involving food and agriculture. What's the default assumption? So with criminal cases in Canada, we assume innocence is our default versus guilt. We don't assume guilty until proven innocent. It's the other way around. Who bears the cost of disproving innocence, and that's the state. And it could be versus an aggrieved person. It could be, if you had to prove you're innocent, then it'd be the accused who would have to bear that cost. And then what standard of proof do we need? And with criminal cases, we think about reasonable, beyond reasonable doubt, which in statistical terms, you might have think of like beyond, less than 5% probability or less than 1% probability, say 19, a certain number of times. So that's a burden of proof. I'm just going to set that aside because I'm going to bring it back in here now. The standard for releasing transgenic crops in the United States was established 40 years ago or so. And it was established that if something new, like a genetically modified, so this would be a herbicide resistant or insect resistant crop, if it was substantially equivalent to its natural antecedent. So if we think about a papaya, is it basically the same thing as the papaya which is natural? And if we're selling that papaya and the papaya has no negative health effects or whatever health effects it has, we're selling it. If I produce something else, another papaya, and it's the same kind of substantially equivalent, then we'd assume no additional health risk, no new health risk. There may be a health risk, but it wouldn't be seen as a new health risk associated with the new food, right? So this is an interesting, I say, not too different is good. So we want something that's basically the same, but has a little bit different, right? It'd have to have a little bit different for you to get a patent on it, right? So it must have something different, but for this to meet substantial equivalence, we don't want to be too different, okay? The way substantial equivalence in the law, this was done by the US Department of Agriculture, and it was first based on advice from the Food and Agriculture, UN Food and Agriculture Organization. It was seen as, well, what will we say is like, too different or just more or less the same. Mostly it's being taken as the chemical and nutritional composition. So if a product otherwise has a similar chemical makeup, similar nutritional content, then we say those foods are substantially equivalent, which gives us a big range because lots of foods have variation naturally in their chemical makeup and their nutritional composition by that, right? By the soil that they're growing on, by the inputs which are going to them. Small differences can mean fairly large differences in chemical and nutritional composition. So these foods tend to have a fairly broad range that the GM food can fit in, the new GM food. So substantial equivalence gives lots of room for new GM products to come in, okay? And therefore, to be allowed, all that the company to sell the new GM food, if you hold substantial equivalence, is that it is nutritionally and chemically the same or similar to food which is already available. The company doesn't have to show that there's no new health risk. They just have to show that it's not, there's nothing much different about it than something which is already being sold. In the law, there's no description of environmental risk. So there's lots of concern about environmental risk. Once a GM food has been approved to be substantially equivalent to a natural antecedent, so a natural origin crop or parent material or natural comparator, then the burden of proof to remove approval is on those who want it removed. So therefore, anyone who would say, well, we don't believe that, we believe that there are health effects of glyphosate, we would have to, and glyphosate's already approved as glyphosate is seen as similar chemically to some other pesticide, then you would have to show that you'd have to go above and beyond to show that there was a negative effect, and that's really difficult to do. An alternative principle to substantial equivalence is the precautionary principle. And this is laid out here. This is the wording from the Cartagena Protocol that I'll talk about in a minute. So if an action or policy has suspected risk of causing harm to the public or the environment, so this particularly mentions public risks like health risks and environmental risks, in the absence of a scientific consensus that harm would not ensue, the burden of proof falls on those who would advocate taking the action. So if I want to bring in a genetically modified soybean to Paraguay, I'm going to have to show that there's a scientific consensus that that new genetically modified soybean is not going to cause any negative effect on the environment and no negative effect on people's health in Paraguay. Right? And I would have to bear all of the costs to do that, right? So if I'm the advocate, I want to bring this in. So either an importer would have to cover that cost, or an exporter who wants to sell their product in Paraguay would have to bear that cost. So this means there's a strong kind of inertia for the status quo and large costs of new things. This principle is embedded in lots of environmental law and legal agreements, including things like the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances, the 1992 Rio Declaration, and is a foundation of the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. So the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety is about dealing with movement of living, what are called living modified organisms is the language they use, or you could just say genetically or transgenics. It constrains the movement of transgenics between countries to abide by the precautionary principle, which means if Monsanto wants to sell stuff somewhere else, by this protocol, they must prove to the satisfaction of the importing country's authorities that there is no additional health risk or environmental risk. So just kind of sort this out then, we have this very permissive regulation of transgenic foods in the United States under the US FDA Food and Drug Administration ruling. So it allows for patenting of new GM foods is the first thing that it allows, and it allows so things that can be seen as you can get a patent on them, so they're a little bit different, and also combining that with a substantial equivalence, so not too much different, right? This burden of proof being quite challenging for those opposed to GM foods to to get those banned. There's a much more restrictive approach for, say, pharmaceuticals in the United States. So there's requirement there that any new pharmaceutical which is developed has to have extensive health testing and must be proven to be safe at very low levels of input. Similarly, a similarly restrictive approach is the Cartagena Protocol on living modified organisms, which implements the precautionary principle, and the burden of proof must be on those that favor GM. So this is all laid out, as I said, in this Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, which is one of the elements of the Convention on Biological Diversity. The result of this Cartagena Protocol put in place in the year 2000 is that same time as GM foods have been kind of running away, we're running away with the markets in the US and Brazil and a little bit lesser extent Canada, less so other countries. But as we were running away in some countries, there was almost no new GM foods which were brought into developing countries because of this very high expectation. And you think about an agency licensed to that has the responsibility to say, yes, I'm satisfied that you can bring in your GM food, go ahead, because I've established that there's no scientific consensus, that there is a scientific consensus that there will be no negative effect on the environment, no negative effect on people's health, which is very difficult for anyone to actually take on that responsibility and that kind of liability associated with that. So licensors are very hesitant to accept new GM foods, especially brought in from other countries. This is part of the Cartagena Protocol, is this precautionary principle, but also something called the Advanced Informed Agreement. So the countries, so basically companies can't just kind of sneak things in. They have to say, this is what we'd like to do. Do you agree? And they have to obtain a permission for that to happen. Okay, I'm going to break now and come back with the sixth and final mini lecture for today, which is the case of golden rice.